For 8 years, the people of Willow Creek Valley believed the old ranch at the edge of the mountains had become a place where hope went to disappear. The wooden gate still stood tall, the fields still turned gold beneath the summer sun, the horses still ran across the open land, but the man who owned that ranch had stopped expecting anything from life. Some said he had become too stubborn, others said grief had taken away the best parts of him, but the truth was much quieter. Ethan Walker had simply grown tired of losing the things he loved. And on the evening when a tired widow arrived at his gate with a young girl and a horse that carried a secret from his past, the lonely rancher had no idea that his carefully protected heart was about to face the one thing he feared most. Change. For nearly a decade, Ethan had lived by the same routine. Before the first rays of sunlight reached the Rocky Mountain peaks, he was already outside. His boots crossed the dusty ground while he checked fences, fed his cattle, and repaired whatever the harsh frontier weather had damaged overnight. The ranch had once been filled with voices. There had been music coming from the kitchen. There had been warm meals waiting after a long day of work. There had been someone standing on the porch every evening, smiling when he returned. But those days ended when his wife, Margaret, passed away after a long illness. After that, Ethan stopped inviting people inside. He still helped neighbors when they needed a hand. He still paid his workers fairly. He still left fresh water near the road for travelers passing through. But the front door of his farmhouse remained closed. Not locked, just closed. Because Ethan believed some wounds healed better when nobody touched them. The folks in Willow Creek often talked about him. "He's a good man," the blacksmith would say, "just a man who forgot how to smile." Others believed he had chosen loneliness. Maybe they were right. Because loneliness was easier than losing someone again. One cold evening in late October, a powerful wind moved across the valley. The sky was painted orange and gray as Ethan stood near the barn, looking over his land. That was when he noticed something unusual. A horse track. Not from one of his ranch horses. A stranger's horse had crossed his property. Ethan tightened his coat and followed the trail toward the old wooden gate. He had learned long ago that unexpected visitors usually brought unexpected problems. But what he found waiting there was something he never imagined. A woman stood beside the gate, holding the reins of a large black horse. Her dress was faded from travel. Her coat had been repaired more than once. A small girl stood beside her, holding a worn cloth bag close to her chest. The woman looked exhausted, but there was something steady in her eyes. Beside her stood Ethan's missing horse, Ranger. Ethan froze. For 3 days he had searched every hill, every creek, and every narrow trail looking for that animal. Ranger was not just a horse. He was the last gift Ethan's wife had given him before she passed. Slowly, Ethan walked closer. "Where did you find him?" he asked. The woman lowered her eyes respectfully. "My daughter and I found him near a river crossing about 15 miles north," she answered. "His leg was caught between fallen branches. We stayed with him through the night until he could walk again." Ethan looked at the horse carefully. There were small marks on Ranger's coat, but the animal seemed calm. The little girl reached up and gently touched the horse's neck. "He kept looking toward the mountains," she said softly. "I think he was trying to come home." Those words stayed with Ethan. Trying to come home. The widow noticed his expression and quickly stepped back. "We don't want trouble, sir. We only wanted to return what belonged to you." Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out a few bills. "You saved my horse, take this." The woman shook her head. "No, thank you." Ethan looked surprised. Most people wouldn't refuse money after a journey like that. The woman gave a tired but honest smile. "My husband always told me that doing the right thing loses its meaning when you expect payment for it." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. He had met many people in his life, people who wanted land, money, favors. But this woman wanted nothing. She only wanted to keep moving. That was when Ethan noticed the small details. The girl's boots were too thin for the cold weather. The woman's hands were rough from hard work. Their belongings fit inside one small bag. They were clearly struggling, yet they had spent days helping his horse instead of themselves. "Where are you headed?" Ethan finally asked. The woman hesitated. "Anywhere that needs honest workers." Her name was Sarah Whitmore. Her husband had died the previous winter while working far from home, leaving her alone with her daughter, Lily. Since then, they had traveled from town to town searching for a place where they could earn their way instead of depending on strangers. Ethan understood that kind of pride, because he had lived with his own pain for years. The sun was disappearing behind the mountains, and the temperature was dropping quickly. Ethan looked toward the long road ahead. "That pass gets dangerous after dark," he said. Sarah nodded. "We'll manage." Ethan looked at the child beside her. Lily was trying hard to appear brave, but her tired eyes revealed the truth. Nobody should have to prove their strength every minute of every day. After a long silence, Ethan opened the gate. "You can stay for supper." Sarah looked surprised. "We don't want to be a burden." "You returned something important to me," Ethan replied. "The least I can do is offer a warm meal." It was a simple invitation. But for Ethan Walker, it was the first time in 8 years that he had welcomed someone through that gate. Inside the farmhouse, Sarah and Lily sat quietly at the dinner table. They noticed the empty chair near the window. They noticed the untouched room that still carried memories of another time. Ethan noticed them noticing. But he didn't explain. Not yet. That night, something strange happened. Lily laughed. It was only a small laugh when Ranger pushed his nose against the kitchen window looking for a treat. But that sound traveled through the old farmhouse like a forgotten song. Ethan stood still for a moment, because he realized he couldn't remember the last time he had heard a child laugh inside his home. The next morning, Sarah prepared to leave. She folded their blankets, picked up their bag, and thanked Ethan for his kindness. But before she reached the gate, Ethan looked toward the northern fields. The fence there had been damaged by the recent storms. An idea crossed his mind. "Those posts won't repair themselves," he said. Sarah turned around. "I suppose they won't." Ethan looked at her. "If you're still searching for work, the ranch could use someone willing to help." Sarah was silent. She understood what he was offering. Not pity. Not charity. A chance. And after years of searching for a place where she belonged, that chance meant more than money ever could. But neither Ethan nor Sarah knew that bringing her into his quiet ranch would uncover a hidden truth connected to her late husband. A truth that would challenge everything Ethan believed about loyalty, loss, and the promise he had made years ago beneath an old oak tree. And before the winter ended, that promise would change all of their lives forever. Sarah Whitmore had expected many things when she stepped onto Ethan Walker's ranch. She expected hard work. She expected long days. She expected the quiet judgment that often followed a widow traveling alone with a child. But she never expected the old ranch to slowly begin feeling like home. The first few weeks were not easy. The Walker Ranch was large, and after years of being managed by one man, everything needed attention. The garden behind the farmhouse had become overgrown. The porch boards needed repair. The kitchen shelves were dusty from years of sitting untouched. Sarah did not complain. Every morning before sunrise, she was already awake, preparing breakfast and helping where she could. Ethan noticed. He noticed how she saved every scrap of food. How she carefully folded old blankets instead of throwing them away. How she thanked every ranch hand by name. Small things. Things most people ignored. But Ethan had spent enough years alone to notice kindness when he saw it. Lily, Sarah's daughter, brought an entirely different kind of life to the ranch. The little girl followed the ranch workers around with endless questions. Why did horses recognize certain voices? How did cattle know when a storm was coming? Why did old wooden fences make so many sounds at night? The ranch hands who once spoke only about weather and work began laughing again. Even Ethan found himself changing. Not quickly, not all at once, but little by little. One evening, Ethan stood outside the barn watching Lilybrush Ranger's mane. The horse that had become distant after Margaret's passing seemed different around the child. More peaceful. Sarah walked beside Ethan and watched her daughter. She misses having a place to belong, Sarah said quietly. Ethan looked at her. Children should never have to wonder where they belong. Sarah smiled sadly. You understand that better than most people. Ethan looked away toward the mountains. There were some things he still couldn't say. Like how every corner of the ranch reminded him of Margaret. Like how he still kept her favorite blue scarf folded inside the bedroom drawer. Like how he sometimes stood outside the empty room because walking inside hurt too much. But Sarah never pushed him. That was what made her different. She did not try to erase his memories. She simply helped him create new ones. As the weeks passed, the people of Willow Creek began noticing the change. Smoke rose from Ethan's chimney again. The farmhouse windows glowed with lantern light in the evenings. Neighbors who had not visited in years started stopping by with fresh bread, tools, and stories. The ranch was becoming alive again. But not everyone was happy about it. 3 weeks after Sarah arrived, a man named Harrison Cole rode into the valley. Harrison was known as a businessman who purchased struggling properties from people who had nowhere else to turn. He wore expensive clothes, carried polished papers, and always spoke with a smile that never reached his eyes. He arrived at Ethan's ranch one afternoon, while Sarah was hanging laundry near the house. Ethan Walker, Harrison called from his horse. Ethan stepped outside. I wasn't expecting visitors. Harrison removed his gloves slowly. I came about the woman living here. Sarah stopped moving. Ethan noticed. What about her? Harrison glanced toward Sarah. Her late husband, Thomas Whitmore, owed money, a considerable amount. Sarah's face changed. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Ethan saw fear in her eyes. My husband had no unpaid debts, she said. Harrison smiled. Many people say that after someone passes away. Ethan stepped forward. Do you have proof? Harrison reached into his coat and pulled out folded papers. I have documents. Ethan took them but did not read immediately. Something about the timing bothered him. Sarah had barely found stability, and suddenly someone appeared demanding payment. Why wait until now? Ethan asked. Harrison shrugged. Because I only recently discovered where she was. The answer felt wrong. But before Ethan could question him further, Harrison returned to his horse. I'll give you a few days to consider the situation. Sarah watched him ride away. The moment he disappeared over the hill, she lowered her eyes. Ethan noticed her hands shaking. Sarah. She looked up. There is something I should have told you. The wind moved through the fields. Ethan waited. Sarah looked toward the farmhouse. My husband was not just a railway worker. She took a slow breath. He helped build bridges, yes, but before that, he worked as an accountant for several companies along the railroad. Ethan listened carefully. And Sarah hesitated. And he discovered that some men were stealing money from workers. He kept records because he believed the truth would eventually matter. A quiet silence fell between them. Ethan looked back toward the road where Harrison had disappeared. You think those papers are connected? Sarah nodded. I don't know, but before Thomas died, he told me something strange. What did he say? Sarah swallowed. He said if anyone ever came asking about the records, I should not trust them. Ethan felt a cold feeling settle in his chest. Because now he understood. Sarah had not only arrived at his ranch carrying a lost horse. She had arrived carrying a secret. A secret someone wanted hidden. That evening, Ethan sat alone at his desk, examining the papers Harrison had left behind. The lantern flickered beside him. The room was silent, except for the sound of wind against the windows. After hours of studying the documents, he noticed something unusual. A signature, a name, and a date. The papers were not from Thomas Whitmore's final year. They were from years before. Someone had changed the records. Someone had tried to make it look like a debt existed when it never did. Ethan leaned back in his chair. For 8 years, he had avoided trouble. Avoided people. Avoided anything that could bring pain into his life again. But now a widow and a child were standing in the middle of that quiet life, and walking away was no longer possible. The next morning, Ethan found Sarah preparing to leave. She had packed their belongings. "I won't bring problems to your doorstep," she said. Ethan looked at the small bag in her hand. "You think leaving makes the problem disappear?" Sarah lowered her eyes. "No, but it keeps it from becoming yours." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said something he had not said in years. "You saved my horse when nobody else could find him." Sarah looked up. "You gave him a chance to come home." Ethan looked toward the barn where Ranger stood. "Maybe it's time I do the same for someone else." Sarah's eyes filled with emotion, but she quickly looked away. She had spent years surviving by never expecting anyone to stand beside her. And Ethan had spent years surviving by never letting anyone stand close. Neither of them knew how much their lives were about to change. Because hidden among Thomas Whitmore's old belongings was one final letter. A letter that could reveal the truth about Harrison Cole. And it was sitting inside a wooden box that Sarah had carried with her all along. The wooden box had traveled with Sarah Whitmore for almost 2 years. It had crossed dusty roads, crowded towns, and lonely stretches of wilderness. Inside it were the few things she had left from the life she once shared with her husband. A family photograph, a worn pocket watch, a small collection of letters, and one sealed envelope that she had never opened. Not because she did not want to know what was inside, but because Thomas had made her promise. Only open it when you find someone you can trust completely. Those had been his final words before he passed away. For months, Sarah had carried that promise like a heavy stone in her heart. She had wondered if she would ever meet someone she could truly trust. Now, sitting at Ethan Walker's kitchen table while snow began covering the fields outside, she realized she might finally have her answer. But trusting someone again was not easy. Not after losing everything once. That evening, Ethan sat across from Sarah while Lily slept upstairs. The old farmhouse was quiet. The same farmhouse that had once felt empty now carried warmth. A fire burned in the fireplace. The smell of fresh bread filled the room. And for the first time in years, Ethan did not feel like a man waiting for another goodbye. Sarah placed the wooden box on the table. "I should have shown you this sooner." Ethan looked at the box. "What is it?" "Everything my husband left behind." She opened it carefully. Inside were memories of another life. Ethan picked up the old photograph. A younger Thomas stood beside Sarah, smiling beside a small cabin. "He looks like a good man," Ethan said. "He was." Sarah smiled faintly. Thomas believed people were better than they appeared. He always said a person's true character was shown when nobody was watching. Ethan looked down. "Not everyone is like that." "No," Sarah replied softly, "but some people still are." Her words stayed with him. Then she reached for the sealed envelope. This is the letter he told me not to open until I trusted someone completely. Ethan looked surprised. And you think that someone is me? Sarah looked toward the window. I think you are the first person in a long time who helped me without wanting something in return. Ethan said nothing, because he knew exactly what she meant. He had spent years believing people only came close when they wanted something. But Sarah had arrived with nothing and still offered kindness. Slowly, she opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The paper was old. The ink had faded. But Thomas's words were clear. Sarah read silently at first. Then her expression changed. What does it say? Ethan asked. She handed him the letter. Ethan read the first lines. It was not a confession of debt. It was a warning. Thomas had discovered that several railroad investors were secretly changing financial records to steal wages from hardworking men. He had gathered proof. Names, dates, payments, everything needed to expose the truth. And one name appeared more than any other. Harrison Cole. Ethan looked up. So he knew. Sarah nodded. My husband was trying to stop him. A heavy silence filled the room. Outside, the wind pushed against the farmhouse walls. Ethan looked at the letter again. This could clear your name. It could, Sarah said. But... She hesitated. But people like Harrison don't give up easily. Ethan understood. The problem was no longer just about papers. It was about a man who believed he could take advantage of anyone weaker than him. The next morning, Ethan rode into Willow Creek to speak with the sheriff. He carried the letter safely inside his coat. For years, the people of the town had known Ethan as a quiet rancher who stayed away from trouble. So when they saw him entering the sheriff's office, they knew something serious had happened. The sheriff, Walter Hayes, carefully read the letter. This is important evidence, he said. But we need more than a letter. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? We need proof that connects these records to Harrison directly. Ethan understood. The truth was close. But close was not enough. On the way back to the ranch, Ethan stopped by the old bridge near the river. The same place where Sarah had found Ranger. He stood there for a long time, thinking. Years ago, Margaret had stood beside him on that same bridge. She had once told him something he never forgot. A person who closes their heart to avoid pain also closes it to joy. At the time, Ethan thought she was wrong. He thought protecting himself was the same as healing. But now, watching the river move beneath him, he wondered if he had spent 8 years protecting a wound instead of living. When Ethan returned home, he found Sarah sitting on the porch. She looked worried. What happened? Ethan sat beside her. The sheriff needs more proof. Sarah looked down. I knew this would happen. What? That my past would eventually bring trouble here. Ethan turned toward her. Sarah, look at me. She did. This ranch was empty long before you arrived. Her eyes softened. You don't owe me anything. Ethan looked toward the farmhouse. Maybe not, but I owe myself the chance to stop running from everything. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them felt different now. Not lonely. Comfortable. A few days later, while searching through the old barn for supplies, Lily discovered something hidden behind a loose wooden board. A small metal box. Inside was an old journal. But it was not Ethan's. It belonged to his late wife, Margaret. Sarah carefully opened the first page. And there, written years before, was a name she recognized. Thomas Whitmore. Ethan's face changed when he saw it. How would Margaret know my husband? Nobody had an answer. Until they read the next page. Margaret had written that Thomas once helped protect the Walker family ranch during a difficult time. He had refused payment. He had simply said that good people should help each other. Ethan sat quietly. All these years, he had believed his world had ended when Margaret died. But now he discovered that the person he lost had left behind a connection he never knew existed. A connection that led directly to Sarah. Sarah touched the journal gently. Maybe we were meant to find this. Ethan looked at her. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to believe something he had forgotten. That some things were not lost forever. But before they could understand the full meaning of Margaret's journal, a writer arrived at the ranch carrying a message. Harrison Cole had heard about the letter, and he was no longer waiting quietly. The message was short. A meeting at the old courthouse, with one final warning. If Sarah did not surrender the documents, Harrison promised he would make sure the truth never reached the town. Ethan folded the paper slowly. The ranch was no longer just a place where he lived. It was a place he was willing to fight for. And for the first time in 8 years, Ethan Walker opened the old front gate wide. Because some battles were worth leaving the past behind for, the morning Ethan Walker rode toward Willow Creek, the entire valley seemed to hold its breath. The sky was covered with gray clouds, and a cold wind moved across the fields where he had spent most of his life. For years, Ethan had faced storms, broken fences, failed crops, and lonely winters. But this felt different. Because this time, he was not fighting for land. He was not fighting for money. He was standing for a woman who had arrived at his gate with nothing but honesty, a young daughter who had brought laughter back into his home, and a truth that deserved to be heard. Sarah rode beside him. She held the small wooden box tightly against her side. Inside, it was the evidence her husband had left behind. Behind them, Lily sat safely with one of Ethan's ranch workers, waiting at the farmhouse. Sarah had wanted her daughter far away from trouble. Ethan agreed. Some battles belonged to adults. But the reason they fought those battles was always the same. The children. When they reached the courthouse, Harrison Cole was already there. He stood near the entrance wearing the same confident smile he always carried. But Ethan noticed something. The smile was weaker now. Because for the first time, Harrison knew he was not facing a frightened widow who had nowhere to turn. He was facing people who were willing to speak. Inside the courthouse, Sheriff Walter Hayes placed the documents on the table. Several townspeople gathered around. They had heard rumors. They had heard accusations. But now they wanted the truth. Harrison stepped forward. I don't know why this rancher believes he needs to involve himself in a family matter. Ethan looked at him calmly. Because using lies to hurt honest people is everyone's concern. The room became silent. Sarah opened the wooden box. She placed the letter from Thomas on the table. Then she placed the journal pages from Margaret Walker beside it. Sheriff Hayes carefully examined everything. Minutes passed. Nobody spoke. Finally, the sheriff looked up. These records match. Harrison's expression changed. The sheriff continued. The dates, payments, and names written here prove that the financial records were altered years ago. One of the older men in the room stepped forward. I worked for the railroad back then, he said quietly. Many workers complained their wages were missing. We thought nobody would ever listen. More people began speaking. Stories that had been buried for years started coming out. Not with anger. Not with revenge. Just the truth. Harrison looked around the room and realized something he had never expected. The secret he protected was no longer his. It belonged to everyone who had been hurt by his choices. The sheriff took the papers. Harrison Cole, you will remain in town while this matter is investigated. For the first time, Harrison had no clever answer. No confident smile. No excuse. Only silence. As Ethan and Sarah stepped outside the courthouse, the cold wind moved around them. Sarah looked exhausted. I never wanted anyone to suffer because of me. Ethan shook his head. You didn't cause this. She looked at him. Then what did I do? Ethan smiled slightly. You reminded people that doing the right thing still matters. For a moment, Sarah looked away. She had spent so long believing she was only someone passing through. Someone who carried problems from one place to another. But Ethan had shown her something different. Sometimes a person does not bring trouble into a place. Sometimes they bring the courage needed to face it. Weeks passed after that day. The winter slowly began to leave Willow Creek. Snow melted from the mountain paths. The fields turned green again. And the Walker Ranch became something the valley had not seen in years. A place full of life. Children played near the barn. Neighbors gathered for meals. Travelers stopped by for water and rest. The gate that had once represented loneliness became a symbol of welcome. Ethan noticed the difference most of all. The old farmhouse no longer felt like a museum, filled with memories of someone gone. It felt like a home again. One evening, Ethan found Sarah sitting beneath the old apple tree near the edge of the property. The same tree where he had buried Margaret years before. Sarah quickly stood. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Ethan smiled. No. He looked at the tree. For years, I thought coming here would only remind me of what I lost. Sarah remained quiet. Ethan continued. But I was wrong. He looked toward the farmhouse, where Lily was laughing with the ranch hands. I spent so long thinking that opening my heart again meant forgetting Margaret. His voice became softer. But I finally understand something. Sarah looked at him. What? Love isn't a room with only one chair. A gentle breeze moved through the branches. It grows when you share it. Sarah's eyes filled with emotion. She understood those words. Because she had been afraid of the same thing. She thought finding happiness again meant betraying the memory of her husband. But maybe honoring the people we lose means allowing the good they left behind to continue. A few days later, Ethan brought Sarah and Lily to the old ranch gate. The same place where they had first arrived. Where a lonely man had once looked at strangers and seen only interruption. Now he saw something completely different. Family. Lily held Ranger's reins and smiled. I think he likes this place. Ethan laughed quietly. Maybe he knew before I did. Sarah looked at the ranch. I never expected to find a home here. Ethan looked at her. Neither did I. Years later, people in Willow Creek would still tell the story of the rancher who closed his gates for 8 years. But they would also tell the rest of the story. They would tell how a widow returned a lost horse and found a place where she belonged. How a little girl's laughter brought warmth back to an empty house. How a forgotten truth finally found its way into the light. And how one lonely rancher learned that the heart does not heal by staying closed. It heals when it finds something worth opening for again. Because sometimes the greatest gifts in life do not arrive wrapped in gold. Sometimes they arrive on a dusty road. With a tired horse. A brave child. And a person who simply believes kindness is still worth giving. If this story reminded you that one honest choice can change an entire life, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional Wild West stories about hope, courage, and second chances, stay connected for more unforgettable frontier tales.